Hello and welcome to Storytime with Uncle Gravy. Big hellos to Isaac and Theo and Joseph, and I'm hoping today that the YouTube software hasn't twisted and contorted my face into either an angry Uncle Gravy or a disappointed Uncle Gravy or a completely bemused and befuddled Uncle Gravy. But as I record this, who knows? I'll find out at the end, eh? So we're going to carry on from where we were yesterday. Bernie and Chris had been exploring, looking for Ash one last time, and Chris, very unlike Chris, had given up, but Bernie was in no mood to give up on their friend. Bernie stood completely still and listened to the nighttime world, the distant calls of foxes, the late night complaints of young seagulls, and the sound of waves breaking on the nearby shore, and thought about what to try next. They had travelled a long way up the garden that night, along the big wooden fence which acted as a safe border for their land, but now, back at the pond, Bernie thought it would make some kind of sense to travel the rest of the way along the fence, but to go down, right down, to the darkest, tangled and overgrown corner of their land. This was a place the Russells would rarely go, as it was so packed with wild rose, brambles, sticky grass and bindweed. Of course, taking this approach was probably the exact idea or suggestion that Chris would have come up with normally, saying it would be logical to explore one section of a puzzle completely before moving on to the others. Bernie was calmer now and felt a tiny bit of confidence start to build, even though the rain was falling again, all around, splashing down from high up, from plants and trees. A froglet plopped into the pond as Bernie shuffled past, but that was the last animal that Bernie would see for a little while. An old plastic heron lay on its side just past the pond, but it had fallen in such a way that its long beak pointed towards the fence and the darkest corner. In the little light that was available, the heron's eye seemed to be looking down into the corner too, and just this one tiny thing helped Bernie to walk on and begin to wriggle away through the jungle of grasses and weeds and prickles that now loomed up ahead. When you can fit inside a large snail shell, you can also fit in and through some pretty small gaps. But as Bernie went on, the leaves became bigger, the stems and stalks less friendly, and the thorns and pointy things were far more tightly packed and hard to avoid. It was a challenge just to get through some of the openings, especially as it was easy for fur to get wrapped around or stuck onto things when the spaces were so small. But there was something about how hard it felt which made Bernie feel happy, in a funny kind of way. A lot of effort was being used, and Bernie was doing the exact opposite to Chris, but for once felt absolutely confident that it was the right thing to do. Even if it didn't get the result which was hoped for, whatever that was, it was something that would give a feeling of pride when it was remembered. The next hour or so contained a lot of fumbling, stumbling and tumbling, but all the time the fence was there as a guide, rising up, way above Bernie's head and acting as a marker that things were going in the right direction. Eventually, though, and just when it felt like slow but good progress was being made, Bernie came up against a new challenge. It looked as though someone had built a wall made of rough, reddish-brown, smooth brick material. In fact, it was a very large terracotta planting pot, which had been turned upside down and lost a long time ago, and it now blocked the way completely, as the plant life either side of it was now too densely packed even for Bernie to get through. The rain had stopped now, but the steady drip, drip, dripping all around felt like a clock would to you or me. The kind of one that ticks in your head sometimes, when someone waits for an answer to an important question. Bernie had come this far, and was not about to give up though, so walked to the edge of the pot and looked up, which actually involved leaning back, as it was so tall. On the ground, and forming a crispy carpet, were a lot of old ivy leaves, and it was this clue that would provide the answer of how to get over this huge and very unhelpful obstacle. As Bernie really focused hard on the pot, it was just possible to make out where tiny ivy branches and trails had once been. At some point, the ivy from the fence must have reached the pot and tried to snake away all the way round it. So, on the sides of it, which still looked like walls to Bernie, there appeared to be almost a staircase of thin, brown, dead branches. They looked as though they might wind around the pot, all the way to the top, but it wasn't easy to tell. Two thoughts now came to mind. Whether to risk climbing up that high just by using old, flaky, thin branches to step on, and what about when you reach the top? It struck Bernie now that getting down could be considerably riskier than getting up. There was something different and special about that night, though. Bernie was not in a mood to let anything get in the way, and so grabbed onto the first bit of root and gave it a tug. It was dead. Probably had been for quite a while, but it still seemed to be stuck to the pot in some way. Very carefully and very slowly, Bernie began to walk along it, leaning into the side of the pot at the same time, and soon the ground of the garden began to get even darker as Bernie travelled along and up, along and up, along and up, up, up. Something the size and build of a Rustle is never going to break something with its weight, so the old ivy branches now actually did a wonderful job as a staircase. Bernie was relieved that all of his upwards adventuring was happening at night, though. The view to the garden floor was blacked out by the night, so all that was needed was to concentrate on leaning into the pot and placing one furry foot in front of the other. After a great deal of effort and a large amount of courage, Bernie finally reached the top edge of the pot and rolled onto the top of it. It took a little more walking, but Bernie safely crossed the top of the pot and reached the far edge. When Bernie looked down along the edge of the fence, it was finally possible to see where the fence stopped and joined the panels at the end of the garden land, but this was not what Bernie was looking at now. In fact, Bernie wasn't just looking. Bernie was staring, mouth wide open and with eyes becoming even bigger. A part of the fence, near the corner where the fences met, was glowing. The section seemed to be very neat. It was rectangular in shape, at the same level as the ground, and it framed a strange greeny light which created an effect like nothing Bernie had ever seen before. Nighttime has always been the best time for a Rustle to explore and go about business, but Bernie now felt that this discovery must have something to do with Ash's disappearance. Unusual things didn't often happen in the Russell's land. Ash disappearing was unusual. This was certainly unusual, so Bernie felt the two things had to be linked. The dilemma now, though, was whether to try and climb down to the glowing section of the fence, or to go and get Chris. After all, Chris had often said that two minds were better than one, especially if one of them was Chris's. In the end, though, the temptation to find out what was going on down there that night without any more delay was too strong. Bernie very carefully began to pick a root down the other side of the tall planter, and this time it felt a bit scarier, as instead of leaning into the pot, Bernie's face had to kind of hug the pot wall and shuffle walk sideways. The journey down took longer than the climb had done, but eventually a height was reached from the ground that would be safe to tumble from. So with a deep breath, Bernie turned round, faced outwards, and jumped, landing on more crinkly ivy leaves, which acted as a very good cushion indeed. The tangled maze of plants was gone from the area near this glowing section of the panel. Holly's dad had cleared it before cutting the hole, and Bernie and Chris had actually heard it all happen. So Bernie made good progress and soon got closer. However, it was when Bernie got quite close that things started to literally take on a different light. What Bernie had seen and had thought to be part of the fence panel, but glowing, wasn't part of the panel at all. In fact, there was no panel there at all. There was a gap. And not just a gap, it was a large hole, a neatly cut out space, through which Bernie could now clearly see parts of what looked to be another garden land, but lit by mysterious green moonlight. All of these sights at once were too much for Bernie to think about. Russells were doers rather than thinkers, and there was nothing to compare this sight to anywhere in Bernie's head. After shuffling forward, very, very slowly, Bernie got to where the big hole was. Plucking up all the courage that a Rustle had ever plucked up, they held the panel, leaned forward, and peeked very timidly round the edge. The sight that now greeted Bernie's eyes was beyond anything that could have been expected. Directly next to the hole was a shiny, thick metal tower, and at the top of this mysterious tower was what looked like an even more mysterious-looking circular room, which was on a platform and had windows all round it, and inside this room a strong green light was glowing, lighting the ground below it and the air above it. Moths and flies were bouncing off it, and many other winged creatures were flittering around too. Incredibly, a little further on from this light tower, Bernie saw another two, exactly the same, seemingly placed with the same distance between them. And these sights were bewildering, but suddenly there were also new sounds to deal with as well. A loud snuffling and snorting noise bounced around, and, although it sounded a safe distance away at first, it quickly sounded as though it was coming towards the gap. At this point, Bernie couldn't cope with any more new things. Too much was happening all at once, and the instinct to get away from the hole took over everything else. Bernie moved as quickly as possible through the area which had been cleared near the hole and reached the end of the garden. Turning away now from the glowing, noisy, bewildering gap, Bernie carried it on along the end of the fence panel and eventually arrived at a more familiar-looking land. And while Bernie paused, two things were decided. A visit to the hole with Chris would be absolutely essential, and there was now a route back to it over familiar land, which didn't involve climbing brick walls, so they could both come back very soon. The night had started out full of promise, had ended in failure for Chris, but had given Bernie a set of new experiences which would be shared as soon as possible. For now, though, after everything that had just happened, Bernie was very, very pleased and relieved to find a familiar-looking snail shell, wriggle inside, and grab a very well-earned nap. And there's the pause. So quite an adventurous chapter today. And tomorrow, you're probably guessing what's going to happen tomorrow, aren't you? Because obviously Bernie is going to have to tell Chris what the hole looks like and where the hole is. And what would you do? Well, you'd have to go there, wouldn't you? We'll find out what happens tomorrow. So thanks for watching. Stay well. I hope you're happy. And I'll see you soon.